I'm Jim Childress, a University Professor Emeritus and faculty member in the Center for Health, Humanities, and Ethics at the University of Virginia. I'm also a member of the NetEthics Ethics and Public Policy Panel, or EP3, and I have no relevant disclosures. It's my pleasure to introduce this exciting first session on the rise of complex research networks and the need for guidance to ensure responsible research. Three distinguished and exciting speakers will set the stage for today's conference by first tracing the rise of big team science, second, by identifying the ethical challenges that often emerge in these complex research networks that cut across multiple labs and institutions, and third, by examining the need for new guidance for these networks. And of course, there will be follow up throughout the other sessions today. Our speakers in this first session bring multiple points of view. Vice Chancellor Michele Masucci from the University System of Maryland has led important National Academies work. Professor Stephen Fiore of the University of Central Florida is a leader with the Science of Team Science field. Associate Vice President for Research, Geeta Swamy from Duke University, is a physician investigator and leader in research oversight. The format is that each speaker will present for about 15 minutes, and then after all three have finished, we will turn to audience questions. As Susan noted, you can post your questions in the QA function on Zoom, and you can upvote questions using the thumbs up function to elevate questions. Our first speaker is Dr. Michele Masucci, who is Vice Chancellor for Research and Economic Development at the University System of Maryland, Professor of Geography and Environmental Systems at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and research faculty member at the University of Maryland, College Park. She serves on the National Academy's Strategic Council for Research Excellence, Integrity, and Trust, co-chairs the committee now updating the National Academy's influential publication on Being a Scientist, and previously chaired the National Academy's committee planning the 2023 workshop entitled On Leading a Lab, Strengthening Scientific Leadership in Responsible Research. She has no relevant disclosures. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Masucci.
Thank you so much. It is really wonderful to be here with you this morning. I am so excited to be able to talk about this really important topic. I want to thank Susan Wolf and her team for inviting me to be a part of this and for helping me along the way to be prepared. I also want to thank all of the other PIs who are involved in the project because I do think the work is so incredibly important. I am not burying the lead on what I'm going to talk about. It's right there in the first word of my presentation, context. One of the things that Susan challenged me to do was to think about where there are some gaps in our discussion about net ethics. And I'm going to make the case that I think context is something we could consider as a really important factor. And I'll walk you through why I think that's the case. And I would love to hear your ideas about that after I go through my presentation. So one of the things I wanted to do was to take the net ethics concept and just kind of map it out for you. I'm a geographer by training, so I just think visually. That's just how I work, and maybe some of you do the same. So when we talk about net ethics, we're really talking about the zone in the middle of my screen that is blue. It's that gap between individual ethics training and responsibilities and the societal concerns with ethics that we often think about at a large scale. I think that's well spelled out in the documentation on the program, and you can go to the website and learn more. But the idea in individual ethics is that we really place at an early stage in people's careers and training an emphasis on their learning how to do research, how to manage the regulations and follow procedures, how to go through all of the steps of getting their grants, protect their data, adhere to the privacy concerns, make sure that they are working in an ethical way across all of the activities that they engage. And that focus is on their efficacy. They're not only gaining an understanding of what those tools are, but also learning how to use them in the appropriate ways and to make determinations about them, but at a very small scale, the scale of their work as an individual investigator or their work as part of a team. On the other side of this continuum here between individual and societal concerns with ethics is the idea that some of the research that is being done, and I sort of slanted this towards engineering research, but it could be applicable to all kinds of research, is that you have those big questions out there in society that have ethical undertones. And you could think about dual use as one of those examples where we do research and we don't really know what the implications of that research are going to be until apply that in different contexts. And maybe we will be happy about those choices or maybe not, depending on what an individual application looks like on the back end. Similarly, we may have a technology that looks like Teflon is a great example of a technology that seems like it would be a really important one to have. Now we know there are health consequences as well as environmental ones to the production of that. So we think about those as ethical concerns and we talk lots about them and they find their way into the media and into the social consciousness of our society. But what this group does and what we're here to talk about is the gap in ethical considerations between those that are held by individuals and those that are held by society. And those are spelled out in the NetEthics program, but I've listed them here for reference. And it really deals with reconciling conflicting ethical approaches across a network, ensuring that there's a respectful lab environment for leadership, creating processes across networks that emphasize the goals, the sometimes competing goals that may exist and that draw attention into a particular team. I'm going to talk a lot about culture today, and I think it's important to understand that there's a lab culture and then there's culture that might be part of a societal consideration, as will be the case in the example that I talk about later on, as well as building community relationships and working through stakeholder needs. All of those concerns form a complex and intersecting web of things that need to be considered as you begin to scale up your research or participate in much larger research programs or scale up in terms of the impacts of what you're doing. There are lots of different ways to think about scale. And when you do, it becomes more important that you make considerations here. So what I'm going to do in the discussion of this is talk a lot about context as an important qualifier in our approach to addressing these ethical considerations. And by context, I really mean we could be talking about place or an institutional setting, a specific culture, a disciplinary configuration, a paradigmatic framework, or the specific goals and directions that different team members want to pursue. All of those and many others form the plethora of concerns that actually comprise context. An appreciation of context can help us from being prescriptive while we identify our principles, approaches, our tools, and our examples, and can help us to move forward on this continuum from an individual set of responsibility for ethics to a graduated one in lots of different ways and for lots of different people. There's been lots of work that has been done on trying to understand how to better capture the needs of investigators and leaders who are handling a large array of concerns and managing at a large scale. I'm sharing just a few of them from the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine because I think they may be useful to you. You're probably familiar with some of them, but I want to just highlight quickly that one was referred to earlier. It's on leading a lab. This is a workshop that was held in 2024 that focuses specifically on identifying the resources that might be available to leaders of labs and identifying gaps in the literature. Susan was a very big part in organizing that event, and many of the people in this call were part of the individual, were among the individuals who presented. You can find the whole proceedings online. The next volume on being a scientist is actually being updated right now. I'm actually the co-chair along with Alan Leshner of the review of the current volume and the implementation of new modules and new content that will go into that. And we are actively trying to think about how we can reflect the need to consider investigators at different stages of their career and research that is scaled at different levels as we do this new volume, because we know that there's a gap out there in information that people can access to gain a sense of the guiding principles that might apply to their sort of that to the gap in that continuum model that I showed earlier. Another which just was released this year, actually quite recently, is fulfilling the public mission of land grant system with a heavy focus on the collaborative framework that land grant institutions utilize. And, I think we can't skip past land grants, land grant universities and land grant missions as an important form of collaboration and a sphere where we need to be thinking about ethics. There is another Academy book on enhancing the effectiveness of team science, which you're going to hear a little bit more about later on from Stephen. And finally, fostering integrity in research has a small nod to the importance of understanding that collaboration is emerging as the mode of doing research for so many fields. So these are just a few. There are lots and lots of other resources that you can find on the website, but I wanted to highlight these because I think it's a useful point of departure for us all and a common set of understandings. I want to dive a little bit deeper into on leading a lab. Because what that workshop did was to inventory resources, issues, and solutions connected to lab management and leadership. It provided examples of strong leadership and management practices. There were case studies of labs that are being well managed and lots of examples of how to think more holistically about doing that work. There was a review of the science connected to the study of leadership that is applicable to research programs. There was also an examination of details surrounding complexity and how that might shape the way in which leadership is also handled, a consideration of the expanded role of lab leaders, and a discussion of issues around the erosion of trust in science, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. So I think it's really important to understand, it's certainly one of my most important benchmarks, I guess, in this conversation about net ethics, which is that ultimately what's important about having well-managed research programs and having solutions for dealing with ethical issues is that, especially as we think about the times that we're currently experiencing, we want to be able to draw upon that to help support trust in science at the societal level. And there are lots of things that erode that trust. I've just highlighted a few. I'm not going to read all of those, but I did want to make sure that you're aware that that trust issue is, partly because of the complexity of research as we understand today in team science and large scale research projects, in ERC implementations and so forth, where there's not a clear line of sight for many members of the public to understanding what is happening under the hood of that very complex system. Sometimes methods are complex and opaque. Sometimes we hear news stories about the failure of studies to be reproduced, and that causes confusion on the part of people who learn about that. There might be perceived conflicts of interest, and I thought it was really great that everybody announced their conflicts of interest here. I think that's where we need to be, but often you don't hear about that, and that then leads to people making all kinds of assumptions about what the motives are for participation in different projects. Communication is one of the most challenging aspects, I think, for scientists and engineers to be able to share the information that they are learning about, the knowledge that they're creating, the tools that they're creating in a way that is accessible to large audiences and across a variety of different stakeholders. There are high-profile failures that we have and misconduct cases, which was mentioned earlier. As a vice president for research in the past and now vice chancellor for research and economic development, I'm steeped in those kinds of issues. I spend a lot of my time every day dealing with misconduct concerns, and I understand how it erodes against the public trust because they don't know if they can really, count on faculty who are conducting research on leadership to be able to be reliable with the way in which they do their work and the outcomes that they derive. And there can be hidden ethical trade-offs. There can be uneven outcomes. So all of these are things I think we need to carefully consider when we think about what our ethical position needs to be. So I'm going to talk about context. The next few slides are really meant to help us dive into the world of context that becomes a framework for us to look at ethics. And I think one of those I've talked about already, which is that research is increasingly complex, both research design, and in this case, I mean, the scale of the research projects, the interdisciplinarity that may be involved, the volume of data, the complexity of analyzing data, the different approaches that one might take to data analysis depending on one's disciplinary perspective or the way in which that data was gathered, the way that it's being stored, what tools might be available to do the analysis. There are disruptive technologies that impact the frameworks and the paradigms from which we conduct research, such that you may have two very different views of how a study should be done just based on the paradigmatic shift that's going on. And then you may really be in a position where you have very different outcomes that are derived about a topic that everyone maybe previously looked at one way and now is being looked at another. But communicating that to others can be quite challenging, and there can be a lot of ethical issues connected to that. There are regulatory and ethical layers as well in the increasing complexity in research design. For those of you who may be more familiar with research administration as its own sort of specialization, you may be aware of the COGR organization, which has a slide that shows the many hundreds of regulations that are out there and the steep curve with which that's increased over the past 20 years. And that becomes a really difficult part for faculty to manage when they're leading a complex project and simultaneously having to deal with all of that regulatory connection. There are global considerations, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of my own research. And finally, we have a problem with the rapid pace with which software changes, which tools are made available, and all of that makes it sometimes difficult to know which is the best one to use and how does that shape what kinds of outcomes we would have. And then again, pushes against ethics in important ways. Should we be adopting new tools every 6 months, or should we lean into the ones that we have and make them work for us in more robust ways? I think that's a really important question for us to ask when we do these investments in the methodologies and the infrastructure that we use for research. What I wanted to capture in this slide, and I have shared this before as part of my work with the Federal Demonstration Partnership, is that there are two colliding areas of complexity that form another context that we need to be concerned about. And that is the iterative relationship between advancement in science and research and administrative requirements, which I alluded to previously. If we look at the advancement of science, I've just given a few examples of the way in which science is rapidly emerging, whether you're talking about data discovery and all of the different ways in which that's happening, whether you're talking about the requirements for the advancement of science, like infrastructure for cloud computing and all of the data storage and analytic needs that we have, or whether you're talking about dealing with other aspects of data attributes like its interoperability and the standards that are applicable to a type of data, or other requirements like the need to be open in the way in which you disseminate your science because of the nature of the field that you're in. All of this is happening at such a rapid pace that many teams are just chasing as fast as they can the best approach within that model. And related to that,
we'll need to bring it to a close. We're past the 15-minute mark.
Okay, thank you very much. The last thing I'll say on this slide is that parallel to that, there is a very rapid pace with which administrative roles are connected to achieving science. And that happens at institutional level, at federal agency level, in the commercialization process and as a part of investigation. I'm going to jump ahead just a couple of slides so that I can share with you another context, which is an international one, and I won't spend a lot of time on it. This slide simply points out what the different institutional arrangements are for stakeholders and helps to give the context that your configuration with your stakeholders also shapes your context for ethics. And then there's a shared responsibility between investigators and their institutions on ethics. My own work is actually focused initially on an international partnership, and I wanted to introduce that as another context to think about because of the complexity of doing international work. This project was done in the late 1990s, but it's actually a continuing network to this day and a continuing effort around some of the themes. It was a network between multiple institutions, multiple non-governmental organizations in Brazil, and all working on multiple watersheds and other ecosystems to think about how each one was using data to support their own specific goals with respect to the environment. The main product that came out of the Brazilian side of this was the development of a map to show the Atlantic rainforest, which is shown here in this particular image, and I'm happy to talk about that afterwards. But what all of this work ultimately showcased was that there are certain kinds of issues that are relevant to large-scale projects, generally speaking, and then another whole set of issues that are relevant for international projects above and beyond what you would find in a large scale project. And I just have this out here because I think every single large scale project that you might consider, whether it's an engineering research center or whether it's a cancer center, are going to have their own unique set of specifications. They may or may not align with those of other projects. So I wanted to conclude with just that idea. Thank you for giving me a few minutes to do that so that I could tie that together with the rest. And I'm happy to answer any questions that people have at the end of the presentation, at the end of the other presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Masucci. We're grateful. Originally, Dr. Kara Hall, a health science administrator at the National Cancer Institute, was scheduled to speak next. However, she is unable to join us today. We're very pleased that Professor Stephen Fiore will be able to present in her absence. Dr. Fiore is at the University of Central Florida, where he's director of the Cognitive Sciences Laboratory and Pegasus Professor in the Cognitive Sciences program in the Department of Philosophy and the Institute for Simulation and Training. His research integrates cognitive, social, organizational, and computational sciences to investigate learning and performance by individuals and teams. It focuses primarily on complex collaborative cognition and how humans interact socially and with technology. He has served on the National Academy's Committee on the Science of Team Science and on the subsequent National Academy's Committee on Research and Application in Team Science. The latter committee's report came out earlier this year. He has no relevant disclosures. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fiore.
Thank you, James. I'm going to talk a bit about the history of the science of team science and then get into what I'll consider some leverage points for how to address the responsible conduct of research needs with regard to scientific collaboration and these kinds of what we refer to now as these multi-team systems. So first, with regard to the science of team science, this was an initiative started by Kara Hall and colleagues at the National Cancer Institute about 20 years ago now. And the goal is really to try to develop this evidence base, trying to understand collaboration in science, but also try to identify ways to improve the collaborative process. So in doing so, we try to understand the collaborative processes associated with communication, with coordination. We try to understand the competencies necessary for success in science teams. And we also look at factors such as institutional support and federal government support. That is, what are the kinds of policies needed to incentivize scientific collaboration? And getting back into some of the history, this was a paper that came out in a special issue American Journal of Preventive Medicine. Dan Stokols, Carol Hall, and colleagues. What they were trying to do is understand the context, as Michele was speaking about earlier, the context of scientific collaboration, looking at it from a very broad lens, looking at what Dan refers to as kind of the ecology of team science. And you can see there's a lot of attention to the local contextual factors, that is, what are the determinants necessary for success, the kind of leadership that's needed for scientific teamwork, but also trying to attend to the broader context. So in reading the ethics literature, you see this micro, meso, macro discussion where they're trying to pin down the different forms of collaboration, the different factors that would be influencing the collaboration. You see some of that in this initial research trying to understand this ecology of team science. But I also wanted to point out one of our early publications. This came out in 2010 when we were starting to interact a bit more as a community that was crossing disciplines. So this was not only folks from the policy community, from health sciences, but now the social and organizational sciences, data sciences, bibliometrics. We were coming together and trying to wrestle with what we meant by this phenomenon, the science of team science. And we recognize this multi-level phenomenon. We recognize this micro-level challenges, these meso-level challenges, macro-level challenges. And in this initial paper, we really wanted to identify those and specify what was going on in these different levels of collaboration to try to understand what was impacting what. If there was a higher level factor that was impinging on a lower level factor, if there's a lower level factor like the individual needs, how was that affecting the collaboration? So again, you see this attempt to try to understand the complexities of the context associated with collaboration. But more formally, what we then did shortly after that was we used Bill Trocum's concept mapping process to try to do a better job understanding what we thought of as the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns associated with collaboration in team science. So if you're not familiar with this, this is kind of a process of ideation where you bring together a number of stakeholders. And in this case, we used a very simple prompt: what topic that should be part of a comprehensive research agenda for the science of team science. So we solicited stakeholder input, hundreds of stakeholders participated in this, and out of that we came with this kind of map of understanding the features associated with collaboration. So inherent in this, again, are these micro, meso, macro level factors. Here, focusing on the disciplinary dynamics associated with the team. Here are some of the science needed to improve collaboration. Here are some of the structural and organizational factors associated with this. But again, really wrestling with trying to understand what's going on with the complex context of collaborative science. And this is just kind of a snapshot. This Carol Hall has put this together to help people understand the history of the science of team science. This is really the first 15 years, showing the different workshops that we've had, the different special issues that we had. We've had conferences since 2010. We formed a formal scholarly organization around 2018. And now we're also part of an international alliance, the Global Alliance for Inter and Transdisciplinarity. We're trying to come together, trying to understand how it is that we can improve these kinds of complex collaborations. But the reason I'm here today speaking is what you heard Michele refer to earlier, that we were brought to the table to talk with the folks of the National Academies when they were putting together this on leading a lab workshop and try to think about the issues connected to the science of team science. And as they pointed out to us, we really did not discuss the responsible conduct of research, and we really did not bring up ethical issues when we were talking about scientific collaboration. So the attempt to bring us into this was to see what we could do to remedy that gap and how we can think about collaboration in team science in such a way that we're paying attention to the responsible conduct of research. So with that, I'm going to transition now and think about what I consider these kind of levers and these kinds of antecedent factors through which we could try to improve the understanding of collaboration with particular attention to responsible conduct of research. So what you see here is kind of a simple model of scientific teamwork. You think about the inputs, the processes, the outputs. You think about the contextual factors associated with it. I'm just going to focus on a couple of things in the limited amount of time. I'm going to talk about the structural features associated with collaboration, and then identify some levers and some interventions associated with that. But one of the things that the NetEthics people wanted us to talk about with regard to scientific teamwork is what we refer to as a multi-team system. This is a structural factor associated with the kind of research networks that we see in NSF engineering research centers and NSF science and technology centers, but also in National Cancer Institute research centers. Essentially, these are teams of teams. This is not just a team. This is not an individual scientist. These are multi-team systems in the sense that you have a number of different kinds of collaborators coming together. They are working on their own teams, but those teams are collaborating towards a higher goal. And in the organizational sciences, in the general study of teams, we refer to this as a multi-team system. Out of that study of these kinds of collaborations, we've identified a number of features, a number of characteristics that make them different from teams, also makes them different from organizations. So one of the considerations associated with this is the goal hierarchy, where you have a superordinate goal, but you also have sub-goals at the different teams. There's a coordination challenge associated with the inter-team interdependencies. There's a need for boundary spanning, where the teams have to work with each other. So you need people who are able to collaborate on different teams. And you have a different kind of leadership. You not only have leadership at a team level, but you have a multi-team system kind of leadership. So with that structural consideration in place, one of the first things to think about, though, is what are the structural factors around MTS that need to be attended to when it comes to the responsible conduct of research? So when we think about this idea of a goal hierarchy, one of the first things that comes to mind is the fact that these local goals can conflict with these superordinate goals. So you have teams of teams, and within a team, they could have different metrics. They could want faster publications. That could differ with some of the higher order goals associated with the quality of the data collection. When it comes to inter-team dependence, there could be issues associated with how they're passing along the data from one team to another. This could be a responsibility of diffusion. There could be sloppy record keeping about which the other teams are not aware. When it comes to the inter-team differentiation, that is these teams of teams working together, there could be status hierarchies or these status imbalances that create kind of conflict where the support teams may be led to certain kinds of inequities in these collaborations. A challenge with the need for boundary spanning could come up when you have these people who are on multiple teams acting sometimes as a gatekeeper. They may suppress bad news. If they're undertrained in responsible conduct of research, they may not recognize when something like misconduct could be happening in one of the other teams. And because of that, the boundary spanners could fail to act and try to address needs early on. And then the big challenge is, of course, with leadership and this inter-team leadership. And sometimes what you'll have is the leaders are not recognizing the implicit signals that they're sending, where they may be changing the way people are focusing on things like speed versus rigor. So these are the kinds of features, the structural features associated with multi-team systems that need to be considered when we talk about responsible conduct of research. Now, I want to look at a different kind of lever to think about with regard to responsible conduct of research. And this idea of strategic planning and logic models. So in the science of team science, we do talk about the kinds of conceptual frameworks that are necessary for collaboration. But at the policy level, if you look at NSF, if you look at NIH and what they want these research networks to do, they want them to be reflective. They want them to think more broadly about their research, about the goals and what they're trying to accomplish. And as part of that, they have these centers, they have these people come together, they develop strategic plans where they have to articulate their mission, their vision. They also develop logic models where they try to understand the relationship between the research and the outcomes associated with that. And these are important tools. These are important cognitive and collaborative tools because they develop meaning, they create a shared meaning for the researchers, for these broad research networks. But I want to talk about them in kind of a different way. Because in looking at this literature, there's not a consistent way these are created. So I just grabbed some logic models from the web from different research centers, and you can see that these are put together in very different ways, and there are different approaches to doing this. I bring this up because when we think about the creation of these logic models, or when we think about the creation of strategic plans, more often than not, we do not have the right people at the table with regard to responsible conduct of research. We just have the people focusing on the complexity of the context of the research that they're trying to do. This is problematic because if you don't bake in the ethical considerations early on, you create these broad plans, these broad models that are not necessarily focusing on the responsible conduct of research. So the point I wanted to make is when the policy community is enforcing the need to develop these, they need to make sure that the right people are at the table. And I wanted to talk about a specific kind of bottom-up approach, which is contrasted with the top-down approach, where the top-down approach is these plans or these models are developed by the leaders of an institute. The bottom-up approaches, though, are the ones where there's a broad stakeholder input in that. So one of the more impressive creations of a logic model that I've seen was done for the transdisciplinary tobacco uh, use research centers. And this was done a number of years ago. And it was a combination of this concept mapping process and the logic model process. Just to go through this quickly, I mentioned the concept mapping earlier. What they did there was they brought hundreds of stakeholders together. They asked them to think about the needs for this kind of research. Out of that, they created this cluster analysis of the variety of needs. These were thematically organized into process, into structure, and outcomes. And then from that, they built the logic model. What matters with this, though, is that they had hundreds of different people participate. This was not just the leaders of the organization. This was many people were brought to the table. They cast a wide net of participants, and this built a very comprehensive picture of this problem space. So I recommend that these are the kinds of things that need to be done when it comes to thinking about network science and responsible conduct of research. And in the last couple of minutes, I want to identify another structural level, but this has to do with more the micro meso level and this idea of team mentoring. So there are team mentoring programs at the NIH, at the National Science Foundation program, where they're bringing in, they're supporting postdoc research in various forms. But I'm specifically focusing on the team mentoring because this is very relevant to these kinds of research networks. And this idea of team mentoring, my colleague Darsharan and Shaw and I articulated a few years ago in a handbook on mentoring, where we talked about the variety of mentoring needs associated with science teams. It's not just the political dynamics that need to be mentored. There's different disciplinary issues that need to be attended to in these kinds of science teams. So we wanted to articulate what are the competencies needed when you are part of an interdisciplinary team, and how can team mentoring facilitate that? So we wrote about this, we talked about these competencies, but for the purposes of this talk, what I did was try to think about what are the ways we can integrate ethics into team mentoring. So as I noted that we had identified these competencies that are necessary for team mentoring, things like active listening. Well, thinking about that in the context of ethics, we can consider something like ethical deliberation. How can a mentoring team facilitate understanding things like ethical uncertainty associated with the collaboration? So can they, for example, model the right kind of conversation when there might be some ethical red flags emerging? Other factors such as nonverbal communication are necessary for this in the context of the responsible conduct of research. You need to be able to listen carefully and understand when there might be some kind of tension associated with a research practice that a mentee may not be speaking about. There's other coordination challenges associated with this when it comes to team mentoring. We talked about this as relationship management competencies from the standpoint of mentoring in teams. What could be practiced here is ethical humility, where, for example, when the mentor is working with the mentee from different disciplines, help them understand the importance of recognizing disciplinary norms and appreciating and respecting these disciplinary norms go a long way in supporting the collaboration. It could help surface any tension that might exist. And these are just some of the ideas associated with team mentoring that can be built into the responsible conduct of research needs when we think about these kinds of meso level collaborations. So I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to end it there. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Dr. Fiore. We're very grateful. And you'll get a chance to hear from him again in session 3. Our final speaker for this session is Dr. Geeta Krishna Swamy. She's at Duke University, where she is Haywood Brown, MD, Distinguished Professor of Women's Health, Professor of Obstetrics and Gynecology, Executive Vice Dean for Clinical Sciences and Research, Administration for the School of Medicine, and Associate Vice President for Research. In these different roles, she oversees clinical departments and research centers, facilitates research priorities, and collaborates with leaders across Duke to provide a consistent vision for research administration, operations, quality, and accountability. She is a highly accomplished clinical scientist whose research focuses on perinatal infection, maternal immunization, and complications of pregnancy. She participated in the National Academy's workshop entitled On Leading a Lab. Dr. Swamy has no relevant disclosures. Please join me in welcoming her for this final presentation before we turn to questions.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate being part of the session today. You heard a lot of really important information, reiterating a lot of the work that has gone on from both Michele and Stephen. I'm actually going to speak today without any slides and talk a little bit about some of the things we've done from an institutional perspective at Duke. Not necessarily about the frameworks as you saw in the data supporting the work to date that you saw from both Michele and Stephen, but more to describe a little bit of real world experience here at our institution. So certainly at Duke University, like all of your universities, we're all increasingly engaging in multidisciplinary, multi-institutional research networks. Right? These collaborations allow us to tackle complex societal and global challenges, but they, of course, bring along with that new ethical complexities. When research spans multiple universities, multiple research groups, and often multiple countries, the standard ethics model at one institution may no longer be sufficient. So my goal today is to talk to you all a little bit about highlighting again some of those key levers for ethical practice in these environments and illustrate that with some examples from our institution here. Some of the things I'm going to say are going to be things you just heard from the two previous speakers, but I hope that those are complementary and further reinforcing what they've said rather than seeming repetitive. So in a networked research environment, right, leaders face a lot of issues from the standpoint of conflicting institutional policies and research norms, varied mentoring cultures across our sites, distributed responsibilities, for example, for data capture, data management, as well as collection and management of biospecimens. Significantly varying views on what constitutes authorship, engagement, being part of the team. And I would say a varied level of strength in established stakeholder relationships. And what I mean by that is when you start to work in these network sort of environments, the presumption is that everyone is coming here to talk about the research and get the work done. But the reality is all of those people are people working together. And without established relationships, when you think about how something might come across organically when you're working with someone in your lab or on your research team versus simply throwing people together across those, I think sometimes without that established understanding is what often leads to conflict or concern. So how do we think about developing a shared ethical framework across our institutions? So one of the first practical steps is to think about whether you can co-create a shared ethical foundation across collaborating partners. At Duke, this often takes a shape in several ways, meaning we're trying to provide resources to our faculty that and our investigators and study teams or lab teams that might be involved in this kind of work. We established back in 2018 the Duke Office of Scientific Integrity that is near and dear to my heart on the team in DOSE, and I think a lot of them are probably part of the webinar, listening in on the webinar today. But through that effort, through DOSE, we brought together a lot of our existing research integrity initiatives and then worked to expand them across all aspects of our university. We implemented a institution-wide responsible conduct of research program that goes well beyond the standard requirements of, say, what a sponsor required program might include those elements. We went beyond what I'd say is might be envisioned or felt as a check-the-box activity by doing an online module. And we emphasized content to really think about being inclusive and comprehensive, trying to develop pragmatic tools for our researchers. And that RCR training program is required for anyone involved in the conduct of research. It's not required simply for our trainees, our graduate students, our postdocs, our career development award recipients. Every researcher at our institution, and we went through painstaking ways through our systems to define and identify what that means, is involved in our RCR program. While there is an online module component that could be done, there's also a requirement for interactive sessions over a 3-year cycle. And that can be at the lab level, at a division, at a department level, at a school level. Could also be at our institutional level where we provide content to access. All of that content is published on our website and available for anyone else to use. So from the standpoint of network collaborations, having that cross-institution understanding of what people are coming to the table with, what exposure have they had to RCR training, what exposure have they had to understanding the foundations of working together, and thinking about whether there should be an agreement or at least stated principles early on, where all sites commit to, say, common values from the standpoint of RCR or authorship or mentorship, conflicts of interest disclosure, and that can help significantly to prevent misalignment down the line. I have, as you heard Jim mention, my work is primarily focused in the clinical research space. And I've been thankfully, part of a large clinical trial network, NIH funded. And in that network, which has been established for quite some time, I would say we have very, very detailed policy manuals on how to define authorship, how to define who serves as a PI of record on a clinical trial that might be filed in clinicaltrials.gov or filed with the FDA. But what that can also do, while it sets the stage and baseline, what it can also do is not really provide adequate recognition of other people who might be involved in the work. And so there still can be just setting forth an agreement or a policy isn't enough. You have to continue to have those conversations and figure out how those things are impacting, say, trainees that might be involved or research staff that might do a massive amount of protocol development with regards to study visits, descriptions, regulatory oversight, and so forth. And how do those individuals engage from an ethical standpoint and framework to think about their contribution to the work? When we engage in large interdisciplinary programs, for example, at Duke, we have an office of interdisciplinary programs that is institution-wide, but it's associated with our various institutes, and we emphasize that upfront alignment of expectations. And so that's another way to engage, to identify resources at your institution or identify potential gaps if there's a lack of such resources, and you get to a point where there is a significant amount of work in the space that maybe there needs to be attention paid to that kind of perspective. I want to shift gears now and think a little bit about the ethical and respectful leadership and mentoring across the network, because I think this is a great opportunity to think about how to set the stage. There are tremendous opportunities for leadership in conducting research ethically, right? And those exist at every training stage. Again, looking at our interdisciplinary research studies, that cascades through our network sites. So best practices would assume that mentoring and culture, as well as expectation, should be shared across participating sites or groups. We have mentoring training available at Duke that sounds like to me, or seems like to me, that mentoring has often been something that you are just expected to learn along the way. For folks who are engaged with NSF funding, you know that the NSF RECR training required a component related to mentoring. And that's because relying on just learning how to be a mentor along the way, especially with changing times, changing expectations of our trainees and early career faculty, it really is something that, if we take it seriously, should have some education, training, and tenets set as part of mentoring practices. We actually have components related to mentoring practices as part of institutional policies on research integrity and scholarly conduct through our researcher handbook, which goes along with our faculty handbook here at Duke University. If you think about a multi-institution network with labs, say, in different countries, A PI at Duke really needs to ensure that mentoring and trainee protections, data sharing expectations are clear for all the sites, not just their home institution. And that's where I think we have held responsibility to our PIs at each site to just carry that messaging across individuals at their home institution. And I think the assumption that that will happen is really where we sometimes fail. So rather than assume, it's the kind of thing that may seem awkward to discuss at the beginning or along the way. But to be honest, once you start doing it, the awkwardness of that goes away and it becomes just part of routine discussion and description. I would say that I learned the hard way that having conversations about mentoring or with your mentees, particularly about authorship and about their role in, say, larger scale endeavors, particularly when there are multiple investigators across multiple sites included, is really something that should be discussed up front. So let's think then about when things may go awry, and how do you think about dispute resolution, right? How do you consider dealing with this from an accountability mechanism? Disputes will arise, even with the best baseline principles set forward, the best policies that go forward, the best monitoring. We know that disputes will arise. We're all people, right? Everyone comes to the table with their experience, their perspectives, their viewpoints. And we know that these kinds of things come up. I think the practical steps are to think about how to consider a framework to address disputes that come up. Authorship disputes seem to come up more and more these days, and I think that will continue to happen as collaborations grow in the number of people involved. Data access and rights, responsibilities at the site level, as well as resource sharing. So we need to have agreed upon mechanisms, both for what to expect and then how to manage those conflicts. So what are some practical steps to take? We've talked a lot about how do we build a neutral network-wide process for dispute resolution. You might have been involved with or viewed things like a multi-PI plan that's part of at least a requirement at NIH grants where there are more than one PI. What I would tell you is in dealing with some of those kinds of situations, that plan that's put forward is often something that the investigators put forward and say, oh, well, we'll do this because it's a requirement, but I'm not really sure we really need it. Things won't happen. So I would caution you to say that hopefully nothing will happen and you'll never need to look at that MPI plan ever again. But I would suggest that people really think through how it's structured. And who's engaged, who's involved? Are there neutral parties that can come to the table to help if needed? I'll give you another example that our ethics teams in compliance would be another area to think about. How do we emphasize early communications, say, for example, with collaborations and development of protocols, development with external partners? How do we also set escalation pathways across our teams, but across our institutional offices that we can facilitate and help with? We need to make sure that any principles set forth have time-bound processes and shared accountability across our partner institutions. I would say that here at Duke in the School of Medicine, we have a framework where at the department, center, institute level that we have outlined internal escalation pathways for integrity or accountability issues that may arise. And that has helped a great deal for setting expectations rather than simply things going into a black box. We try really hard when allegations or concerns or issues come into our central office through what we call our speak up line, that we know exactly who to engage with, how to address that, how to move that forward to other offices, other teams, other people involved, and also maintain respect and engagement with the individuals that might have brought those things forward. We have a no retaliation tolerance policy. So we want to make sure that people aren't in other ways felt like they are not fully respected as they bring those things forward for assistance and help. It's really important in that sort of escalation pathway process that we've developed to make sure that governance is well documented, roles of individuals? What are the processes? So to raise that sort of thing at the same level of some of our collaborative efforts and network agreements as well. I've talked a lot about what are the processes when things might go awry and so forth. But at baseline, really all of this comes down to building a positive network culture. Culture is often overlooked, but it is foundational, right? I was just in a meeting the other day where we are doing something pretty grand. It has been publicly described already, but if anybody knows, anyone here who are massive fans of their own institution and engaged in, like, say, local sports rivalries and so forth, Duke and UNC, which is just a few miles down the street, while we have a strong, respectful but competitive nature, we have struggled at the level of institutional, say, partnerships. But we've now engaged in a joint venture to build a North Carolina Children's Hospital. It's going to be a rather bold and courageous effort over the next 7 to 10 years. But one of the things that we really have to do is think about the culture. Every institution's culture is different. Every school's culture is different. Every unit, down to the department or lab level, that culture is different. So we really need to be talking about, at baseline, how do we build a positive culture that respects what people are doing today, but figure out how to be bigger, bolder, brighter together, right? How can we think about these being synergistic efforts that we do? So we've invested a lot in the research space on thinking about how to do this from an interdisciplinary standpoint, right? That we bring together intentionally faculty, students, centers across disciplines. We emphasize multi-level engagement, right, with our community, with our industry partners, with stakeholders across these areas. Think about what are key actionable items for our network leaders to do. How do we also continue to build that culture by hosting regular site meetings? We can't just say at the beginning, we're all in this together, and then wait for the work to be done. We have to continue to reiterate this across the board. I'd also say that while I've talked a lot about investigators and what we're leading, or PIs across the board or at our sites, in my mind, it is imperative that we engage our trainees and our staff. One of the things that we came across in our RCR programming when we embarked on these interactive sessions or workshops was that we brought together faculty, investigators, and our staff and trainees all together at the same level. And our feedback afterwards, it was so telling how many people in our staff, in our lab managers, data managers, clinical research coordinators said over and over again how much they appreciated being at the same table with the researchers themselves. So when we do RCR training, we can't, I think we've missed the mark if we say, here's training for our students, here's training for our faculty, here's training for this type of group, right? The more we can bring people together across these complex networks, the better we'll be to move those things forward.
I think we need to bring it to a close. We're past 15 minutes.
Okay, perfect. I'll do that now. So really, I just want to say, to reiterate some of the things that I mentioned already, we really need to think about having that built shared framework, right? Leading ethically across our sites, establishing governance for positive culture, but disputes as they come up, engaging our communities, and ensuring that we have the ethical obligations are met across the way along the scope of the work. So I'll hand back over to you, Jim, and hope to engage with the others on any questions that might have come in.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Swamy, for this splendid presentation. And we do have, so remind everyone in the audience that you can use the question and answer function, the QA function in Zoom. And you can also use the thumbs up icon to upvote questions. And we do have a couple of questions to pose. And the first one I'll pose to the panel as a whole. This actually comes from our colleague Susan Wolf. When have you seen network ethics fail? And are there cases we can learn from? Do you have any examples there that we can learn from? And this has been hinted at in some of the presentations, but when have you seen network ethics fail? Anyone want to take that on as a starter?
I'm not sure if I'd call it a failure. As much as I'd say it was an issue, but it was resolved successfully. It had to do with stakeholder input and a large-scale collaboration where the center was funded specifically to work with a stakeholder community. And they brought on social scientists in order to ensure that the scientists and engineers were working well with them. And there was some tension, some conflict early on where social scientists felt that they were not being listened to and that the stakeholder input was not being attended to. But the center leadership heard it, listened, and decided to do a better job and take an initiative to ensure that the engineers and scientists were paying attention to what were the needs of the stakeholder community.
All right, thanks. Michele or Geeta, anything?
From my perspective, I've seen a couple of things happen. Certainly, I mentioned before that, I have been involved in misconduct
Mhm.
cases. And so I think when you have a large scale misconduct case that you're dealing with, I think that indicates that you have an ethical challenge going on that team. And that certainly is something that I have seen before, which is why I think it's so critical for us to be thinking about programs that enhance the ability of lab managers to support responsible conduct of research and that they have all the kinds of tools that Geeta talked about at their fingertips. It's not necessary. I don't think we can make the assumption that people just automatically know, have a compass for what they're supposed to do when tricky situations come up. The other thing I have seen are some collaborations that sort of go to the wayside because they weren't able to sustain the ties um, between collaborators, and that's not always an ethical breakdown. But I think it's important to consider that the commitment that we make to each other to work together on something is an ethical bond, especially if one or more parties are continuing to work towards what were the decided upon aims and some others pull away without a proper, I guess, an appropriate conversation about what would be happening. And that's something, again, because of having played the role of being a vice president for research and now vice chancellor, I do see those kinds of things happen. We never like to see it happen, but it sometimes does.
Geeta, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we have, I don't think that we've really touched on that, we think about authorship and research integrity, but another one that seems to come up too is about the financial aspects, right? Like the funding when you're talking about multiple institutions that have different components as part of the funding that might be coming to them, that have different indirect rates, that have different requirements within their units to say, cover tuition remission for students or not, cover different components. And I think that that I have regrettably not seen that sort of aspect covered in many kind of say multi-PI plans or discussions about how people would resolve those specifically. And I think that's an area that while it's not necessarily an ethical issue, it's still something that then raises it to the same level of dispute.
Right. Okay. So I have another question, and this came an anonymous question. When investigators are driven by departmental publication requirements and or other speed volume incentives, how can we persuade them to slow down to include stakeholders in planning their research? Anyone want to respond to that?
Well, I might make one statement first is that one of the things that I find when people bring that up, because that's often been a concern about open science and open scholarship too, is that putting things out ahead is disadvantaging, me as an investigator from making it, right, getting to tenure or things like that, or promotion. I would sometimes make sure that people really do understand what the department or school level expectations truly are. I found over the last 25 years of my career that there are a lot of myths and urban legend about what it takes to be promoted. A guide might say you need 15 papers, and everyone goes, "Oh, now that really means you need 25." You're like, "Well, does it or does it not?" Right? What does it take to actually meet those criteria? And so I think setting the stage from a leadership perspective at a department chair, an APT committee leadership kind of thing is really important, because otherwise people just learn that along the way, and it's hard to dispel those myths.
Any other response?
I would just comment that I think publication rate is a really tricky issue because it varies so much by discipline. And it's really easy for at at the administrative level, or even as Geeta was suggesting, somebody to internalize a rubric that's not applicable to one's own research framework or even discipline, because another department or another division looks at publications in a different way and looks at the rate of publications in a different way. I think we need to really dive into that issue in a lot more depth, because I think it causes a lot of young scholars angst that stops them from doing creative and wonderful things, because they're so worried about who on a committee that's interdisciplinary and they're from a different discipline than what their training is going to look at it from the wrong lens, and then they're going to be sort of stuck without having achieved what somebody else had in mind for them, not in terms of their own framework for themselves.
Okay. I have a couple of other questions from the audience. Dan Chen asks, how do our panelists think about stakeholder mapping? Some stakeholders are clear, but how do we capture the full picture, especially the unknown unknowns who ought to be included as stakeholders? Any comments on that?
Yeah, I think the hard part is the unknown unknowns, and that's where some of these more generative approaches, where you are very casting a very wide net, where you're hoping that through kind of a network approach, where people know each other through degrees of separation, where they're going to realize that, oh, you haven't asked this community or you haven't addressed this person who is really an expert in that. So it's about knowing who is currently part of your team, but more importantly, knowing who on that team really has connections to multiple networks or multiple communities that you hope can reach out and recognize that there's a need that you yourself have not identified. But this is a very difficult issue, and it is associated with the challenge of taking the time to do these things right, because stakeholder mapping in and of itself is going to add time to getting the research going, and that's going to delay the science, delay the publications. And I'm all for this kind of more planful activity, but I think we all need to recognize the challenge associated with this.
Anything else to add? Well, I'll go to the next question from Michael Felder. When you're describing something, what might be called guiding principles, is the source of these principles based on something more than moral consensus about what seems nice or respectful or kind? So a broad question about how we think about the ethical guiding principles in this area, some of which in the discussion that came up clearly based on agreement or a rough consensus. But are there others? How do we think about those principles? Or how do you think about those principles and the work you've been studying and undertaking?
Well, I mean, I think that's tough, because it's at the heart of what do we think of as the word even meaning something is ethical, right? Like, so I think it does come back to sort of core values, particularly one of the things that Michele mentioned about, like, with publication rate, is about the discipline too, right? And so you will see different expectations, different approaches, right, by different disciplines. Yeah, Michele, it struck me when you were saying that about authorship, right? As part of a clinical trial network, publications don't happen until the end of the trial. It may take years for that to happen. So if you're in your early career stage, you're just waiting years for something like that to happen. So it's the same kind of thing. Like, what are the expectations? Not just about being nice, but coming back to respect and understanding of where the people in those disciplines are coming from their baseline expectations. To me, that's, I think, the place to start.
Yeah, I think it's really important to have an awareness that we all have blind spots within our own disciplines as well. And sometimes when we're thinking about guiding principles, it's almost, more a factor of we've been trained in a common way, so we're not questioning to the extent that we might want to what the principles are that are guiding us in our ethical compass. Because the whole problem with ethics is that in order to adhere to an ethical standard, you do have to consider that there are different ethical frameworks that might be at play in a consideration about something, and they might come into tension with each other. If you approach it in a dogmatic way, you're never really going to be able to get to the point where something like that can be resolved. And that can sometimes lead us to fall back into a kind of disciplinary tug of war, something I've seen often. Again, as a geographer, we find ourselves in those kinds of environments often because our discipline is perhaps not as well understood as some others, and so you sort of try to figure out how to be true to what that discipline holds, but also respectful of what is happening in other disciplines. But maybe that's a different. There's a different viewpoint from a different disciplinary standpoint. So I think it's really important to keep that skepticism alive.
Yeah, and I want to build off that because this is really an issue of expertise as well, and I believe very much in expertise. So when we're talking about ethics, I want the experts in ethics at the table as well.
Yeah.
So just like Michele said, there's different ethical frameworks. These are things that are rarely explicitly discussed unless you bring that kind of expertise. Like, say, what kind of ethical framework are you bringing to this research center? Because it could be virtue ethics, it could be utilitarianism. Depends upon the particular approach, the particular viewpoint and perspective of the research community. And once they agree on, or once they identify that, then you can start talking about what are the principles associated with a particular ethical framework. But this is where the education and training comes in. And there's a lack of that kind of education.
And many have argued that, yes, an ethics expert can be useful at least in helping to sort out, modes of approaching ethical principles and their variations and think about ethical traditions. But some also argue that ethics is too important to be left to ethicists, so it becomes a much more complicated, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and human activity to come up with an understanding of the principles and values we think guide us in this area. I don't see other questions. We still have just a few minutes before we end. Are there, you three have been involved in conversations with each other in many different settings. Are there things that, because of the tightness of the schedule today, that you think should have gotten out before the audience that we did not get out? Anything you'd like to add in concluding?
Well, the only thing I will maybe add further is that I do think one thing that I think has helped in this space too, from an institutional perspective, is to make sure that people in the administrative space also have experience in this, right? So that you can look at this from the perspective of research compliance, research administration, grants, all these sorts of things, and not just leave it to these to the investigators or to these folks in ethics alone. I think we need to make sure that everyone across our institutions is really thinking about this if you're even touching the research space and the collaborative space across the board.
Yeah, and there has been a lot of activity in the science of team science around building what we call tools. So tool kitting is, in fact, something that has been very active. And I bring that up because these are kind of artifacts that scaffold difficult processes. So when a big part of tool kitting in the science of team science is the creation of procedures and methods that help with the coordination. It could be collaboration planning. It could be how to deal with conflict, how to deal with authorship issues. These things matter because as external objects, these kind of boundary objects, they themselves mediate the difficult conversation. So it no longer becomes just a conversation between people. This mediating artifact kind of distances that so you can use the artifact to make the conversation easier. It's concrete, it's explicit, so you've taken some ethical frame, you've taken some conflict issue, and you put it into the artifact, and that helps with the conversation. And I bring that up, these kinds of tools, because there's a lot of them out there. And I think that the research network community, but they can reach out to us, those of us in the science and team science community, and just ask us a question. We can point them to the right tools. And because it's difficult to wade through those.
Michele, anything you?
Yeah, I would add, I showed at the very end of my presentation a map of the domain, what's called the Dominio Mata Atlantica. It's the boundary that was the original rainforest on the Atlantic coast, and then there are little dots that show the fragments that remain. So most of it is deforested. There's only 7% of the forest that is remaining. But I mention it because that map is an illustration of ethics at work. One could interpret it from a perspective of a different kind of data set, that it is, a map that meets a certain standard of interoperability and where all the data is at the same scale and so forth. But that's not the case. What was done in the case of the creation of that particular map and the atlas that goes with it is that it was a sort of mashup of whatever data happened to be available, because the ethical principle involved was to publish whatever known information there was, even if imperfect, because there isn't enough time to protect the rest of the rainforest if we wait on the best science. That's an ethical choice. And the ethical choice actually created the knowledge set that is the map, which you saw before you. So that's just something I want us to consider, because I think those ethical tensions that can exist need to be understood and unpacked, because it does shape the way in which we understand the world around us and how we then use information and scaffold upon that to our broader understanding of the phenomenon.
As we move to the conclusion, I personally want to thank all of you for your splendid presentations and for the kinds of issues you were able to bring to the fore. I think that the emphasis that we've heard on collaboration and the kinds of issues that arise there, collaboration that can involve different things, but the importance I've heard throughout of conversation involving multiple parties in really identifying the relevant issues and coming up with ways to resolve them. But also a conversation that takes account of the variety of stakeholders who are involved. Sometimes this will end up in negotiation in which you're trying to, among the parties participating, come up with some satisfactory solution. But sometimes it will tend to principles and frameworks that go beyond those immediate negotiations. So thank you very much, Michele, Geeta, and Stephen. And also thanks to the audience for the questions that you addressed and raised and were addressed. I now turn this over to Professor Shoniqua Callier for the next session on project analyses and recommendations, advancing network ethics.